Greetings. Thank you for joining me for day 5 of the Daily Bread Reading the Bible in a Year project. So I am looking forward to today. Today is day number 5. We're looking at Sunday, January 5th, 2020. Genesis chapters 18 through 20. And so let's get right into Genesis 18. Genesis 18, we get to see that Abraham and Sarah are the characters, and they get a visit from the Lord. So we see 3 men coming to visit them. And Sarah is invited by Abraham to prepare, the blessings to be hospitable towards these guests. And by the Oaks of Mamre, there they are, and they get to see these guests and invite them to come and to take some refuge with Abraham and Sarah. As Sarah is preparing things, she overhears these 3 guests talking about that Sarah will in fact become pregnant and bear a son in this next year in due time. And so Sarah laughs. She thinks it's a funny thing to say that she will bear a child, which that laughter is something that will lead to the name of Isaac, because Isaac means he laughs, or she laughs in this case. And so, Isaac becomes the name of the child that is promised to be born. And then you get this beautiful question of, is anything too hard for the Lord? Right? And we as people of faith, as Christians, really claim and believe that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Though we a lot of times are in Sarah's own footsteps, right? We question how God exactly is going to bring things to come about, and it takes this willingness to accept what God has for us, that God is going to say that these promises will be true. And just remember that with Abraham and Sarah, it's been a long time coming. These promises of God have been a long time coming. And Sarah's thinking, now I'm too old, and why would it be at this point in time in which I would have give birth to my own offspring? But that is exactly what happens here. We see Abraham's faithfulness in receiving that message, but then also these messengers of God, claiming that God is upset. God is not upset with people like Abraham. God's not upset with Sarah, who is kind of wayward in some her own rights, but God is upset specifically at the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham is a little worried because he knows that Lot is by there, and he is concerned for his nephew, his brother's son. He's concerned for Lot and wants to make sure that Lot is okay. So we get this kind of beautiful bargaining that Abraham does with God. This kind of bargaining with God to say that, if I have found favor in your sight, if you really do, intend to bless me and to have this blessing, which of course God does, that Abraham is asking on behalf of, these people that, I don't care about destruction or this violence that is to come and your anger there against, these people. I want to intercess on their behalf. And so, he says, what about 50 people? If there are 50 righteous people in the city that you find, would you destroy a whole city because of 50 righteous people? And God says, well, no, I won't. And, Abraham says, well, maybe I'm a little bold, but how about, if there's less? Or if there's, less, gets him down to 30 and then keeps going with 20. And, even then he says, I know I've been pressing you hard, but what about 10? If there are even 10 faithful, righteous people in the city, would you not destroy it? And Abraham is probably thinking, there's probably 10 righteous people in the city. That should be sufficient. And God says, not for 10. I will not destroy the city. So Abraham does this beautiful trying to curb, God's righteousness, but lean on God's merciful side and appeal to God's mercy. Let's move on to Genesis chapter 19. Now, this is what I would call a chapter of questionable decisions involving inappropriate uses of sexuality. So we have the Sodom and Gomorrah text at the beginning, and then we have Lot's daughters sleeping with him, forcing their will upon him essentially at the end of it. So there is a lot of, in chapter 18, a lot of God, Abraham's righteousness, which is appealing to God. And then here is, we see kind of the theme that we've mentioned before is that, when humanity forgets about God's ways, and that's when humans suffer. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how these two stories are kind of connected at the front and the back end of it. But let's look at, the first portion of it. So Sodom and Gomorrah. God sees this wickedness and the wicked things that they are doing, sends visitors, two angels, to be visitors to Lot, and Lot welcomes them in and sees these visitors. And the whole city, all the men come out from the city, and they basically want to destroy these two visitors of God in a very, very graphic and terrible way to look at it, that they want to essentially have their way and to get to know them, which is the biblical terms for sex in the Bible. And so all of these people want to quote unquote know them, which is a very inappropriate use of sexuality, even in our day and time, because it's more about how they want to just utterly and completely both humiliate these individuals and shame these individuals, and that is something very much abominable to what God's views of appropriate use of sexuality is. People often simplify this story down to say that Sodom and Gomorrah is a destruction based upon, sexuality and homosexuality specifically. But I think it's even more than talking about inappropriate uses of sexuality in general. So the two angels come and they lead Lot and his family outside of there. Lot's wife then, as they were escaping, makes a poor decision to look back. And we see that Lot's daughters also follow in their mother's footsteps and make some poor decisions around, sleeping with their father. And so that's how the Ammonites and the Moabites come to their shameful origin. And those are the ones involved with the conquest of Canaan. They are outside of the conquest of Canaan, the land of Canaan, as it becomes known, the promised land. But the Moabites are the ones who, say this big army that, later on we'll find out is after Moses leads God's people out of slavery in Egypt. The Moabites are ones who don't welcome this, their relatives in some way, shape, or form. They decide not to welcome their relatives and force them to go around their land. So there's some tension that is being pointed out here in the text through this really questionable ways in which Lot's ancestry and descendants come from him. So I don't know exactly if that's to implicate Lot as much as his daughters, but either way, this leads to Lot's ancestry, being kind of the lesser loved individuals than Abraham's ancestry. So setting up this whole dichotomy of, the people who are writing this book, their, ancestors are much better than, the people who are around them instead of them. So I think that's just a subtle dig at it. But yeah, it is very, very strange why they would set up Lot and this relative to be such an immoral character at this time, where he has been shown in very favorable light up until this point. I can only connect it with the Moabites and the Ammonites, which come from that. So let's look at Genesis 20 and just go into it briefly, because it's kind of a repeat. It looks like it's a repeat of Genesis chapter 12, the Pharaoh encounter that we had in Genesis chapter 12, where King Abimelech, king of Gerar, we see him welcoming Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham going to pretend that Sarah is his sister. And so though I should say not pretend, because here it's made very clear that Sarah is his relative, is his sister, through marriage. And so that way he is not lying. He is still being faithful to God and not lying. As the Ten Commandments, say, thou shalt not lie. And the people, his ancestors who are reading this, are going to be aware of the Ten Commandments and that he shouldn't lie. And so they're going to try and put their own spin on this, saying, well, Abraham and Sarah are connected, and so that this is not, in fact, a lie. So it's interesting. I think I would do a lot of comparison between chapter 20 and chapter 12. I think you can go back and look at that. And yeah, drop me your opinions on what's happening there. I'd love to hear your feedback on what's happening in Genesis 19 and your kind of reactions to like the strange twofold way of the two stories of the inappropriate uses of sexuality and the top part of 19 and the bottom part of 19. I think it's very fascinating to look at this and to claim this as a book of faith, and to say that it is in fact important of how we use our sexuality, and God cares very deeply about how we use sexuality, and if we do that inappropriately or appropriately. So I'd love to hear your feedback, and thanks for listening to day 5 of the Daily Bread adventure.